just a little bit of thank you. We're going to give everybody just a little bit of time to filter in. And while we're waiting, we would love for you to fill out the poll just so that we have an idea of who is in the room. And so there's two questions. Who is represented in the room today, as well as regarding your volunteers, how your executive leadership feels towards your volunteer and your volunteer program. So as we are welcoming people in, please go ahead and answer the questions to those polls. And again, if you would like to just drop in the chat where you are joining us from, your name and like where you're joining us from. Additionally, we're expecting a pretty decent crowd, so I'm very excited about that. And we want to make sure that your questions do not get lost in the chat. So if you have a specific question that you want to make sure that the panelists are able to answer, please drop it in the Q&A so that we are guaranteed to see that, so that we make sure that it doesn't get overlooked. So we're going to give it just a few more minutes and then we will get started. Again, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're very excited that you all are here. I'm very excited about this particular conversation. If you could please just fill out the poll so we have an idea of who is in the room. First question is who is represented in the room, and the second question is regarding your volunteers. How does your executive leadership feel? Their attitude towards executive leadership. So let me see. Want to make sure everything is ready to go over here, which we are. Okay, let's see. Thank you so much for carving out time on your Monday. Wherever you are, Mondays are hard after a weekend, but this is so worth the conversation. So I'm excited that you're here. Okay, we're going to give it just a couple of more minutes. Thank you to those who are still coming in. We appreciate you coming in. Again, you can answer the poll, who is represented in the room today, as well as what is the perception? How do you feel your executive leadership feels towards your volunteers? And if you haven't as yet, you can drop your name in the chat and like your name and where you are joining us from. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to, let's see here. Based upon what we have in the poll so far, I'm going to just give these just so that we know, and then we'll dive right in. We have about 26% coordinators, 35% manager, 30% directors, 7% senior leadership, and 2% executive directors. And then in terms of regarding how the perception that you have of your executive leadership and how they support you, are they extremely supportive? Are they generally supportive? So we have 29% extremely supportive and care a lot. 49% are supportive. 22 to 24% are neutral. Well, this is really good. 0% are not supportive, and 0% are like, wait, we have a volunteer program. So that's encouraging. That's a good place to start. That's a good place to start. So I'm going to end the poll and share my screen and introduce you all to everybody that's here, because you didn't come to hear me, you came to hear from them. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us for Ask an Exec, what execs really think about volunteer programs. Just a few housekeeping items. I mentioned this before. Please note that all attendees are on mute. And if you have a question, to please make sure to drop it in the Q&A box. The chat box, you can interact with each other. You can also drop questions in there, but we would rather you drop it in the Q&A, because then this way we can make sure that our panelists will see it. The session is being recorded. We want to thank you to our platinum sponsor, Better Impact, for helping us bring this to you. And we wanted to let you know about the hybrid conference that's coming up. And a lot of what we're talking about today is going to directly connect to this. So be aware and be ready and be listening, because it's something that you might want to be interested by the time this conversation is over. I also just want to let you all know about our National Summer Summit on Volunteer Engagement that's coming up as well. And so more announcements are coming on that. And we do have these types of academies that happen throughout the year. Our next one is on Tuesday, July 15th, an in-person situation approach to skills-based volunteering, lessons from the psychology of volunteerism. I think that's going to be very exciting. Okay, so I am now going to introduce our panelists. If they are not already on screen, they can come on and make themselves seen, because this is going through the webinar thing. I'm not sure who can see what right now, but if they're not already on, they will come on in just a second. So I want to start off with Stacy Groff, MNM. Stacy is the Vice President of Care and Connection for Empath Health. She oversees, at any given time, they have 3,000 ongoing volunteers, and they have an ROI of $8 million. She received her certificate from Wharton School for an executive presence and influence, which is pretty fabulous, considering that we have the Regional Director of International Relations from the Wharton School here today. So that would be Joshua Thomas. And what many of you all may or may not know, but you will find out by the end of today, is that Joshua is actually the reason this session is happening. After a conversation that I had with him after I was laid off, there was something that he said that changed my perception of volunteer engagement and how we interact with our executives in a way that has I'll never be the same. So starting with, that's why we're here. And lastly, but definitely not the least, we have Anwar Nasir. He's the Executive Director of the Louisiana Philharmonic Orchestra in New Orleans, Louisiana. And we have a long history from connecting from another organization where he has shared a lot of his expertise. And many may or may not know that he is one of the very first Black executive directors in of an orchestra. And so a lot of the challenges that he has had to overcome, actually his story ties, believe it or not, very there's some things that are very similar about like volunteer engagement and understanding that your audience and who you're talking to and how to speak up and also stand your ground at the same time. And so I'm just so glad that he's here for that. So with that, I want to welcome everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. And we are going to dive right in. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We're going to dive right in. Okay, so first question on everybody's mind. Well, it definitely was on mine, so I'm good. And, and I'm in a lot of rooms. I hear it a lot. The question that I have for our executive panel, first thing is, why is it that whenever funds seem to get restricted or an organization starts to have financial challenges, the very first thing to get cut is the volunteer program? So Stacy, I'm going to start with you.
So I think what happens a lot of the time is that it's one of the programs we don't have a lot of data on. We tend to have lots of data in the world I live in, things like patient care, patient satisfaction, nursing impact, medication influence on patients, financial sources, all of that's really concrete. But when you look at a lot of the programs under volunteer engagement, a lot of us have a lot of stories great stories about what we're doing, but that doesn't always translate to the executive level. So making sure that you can speak the language of the people you're talking to, which could be a completely different language as when you're talking to, let's say, your marketing department. Figuring out how you make them understand the value of what you're doing. And that could be something like a dollar value, that could be some metric that you look at in your organization. We have pages of reporting where I'm at currently. Knowing your true ROI, what does it cost to run the program? Because a lot of organizations will look and say, well, it costs us, let's say, $500,000 to run that program. I can't see what we're getting back from it. So you've got to be ahead of that in making sure they're understanding on a day-to-day basis before the situation comes where you're looking at funds. You want those team members on a C-suite to hear volunteer engagement and be thinking, there's no way we can let that go. That's a differentiator for our organization. It's what makes us different from, let's say, organization B or C in our area. So that would be the main thing I would say out of the gate.
Anwar, I'm going to kick it over to you because you work with volunteer programs, but not necessarily directly. Like you guys have people who you work in tandem with. But so your perspective is going to be a little bit different. But when we were preparing for this, you definitely were like high-fiving Stacy on what she said.
Yeah, absolutely. It's our volunteer organization actually it's a completely separate 501(c)(3), and what they do is they actually run two businesses as a part of it. And outside of, yeah, I would say like government and some other outstanding funding sources, our volunteer organization is actually our largest funder to the organization on an annual basis, which is a really, really amazing thing. So when Stacey was talking about it as we were prepping, it was a really interesting thing to think about because, our volunteers, and we all know this, that people give their time is like probably the most like precious thing that they have to give. Like it's easy for a lot of folks to write a check. It's easy for a lot of folks to come in and do like a maybe a 1 day thing, and those things matter. But to say we're going to do this over the course of the year and do it as a way to help really transform the business, like that case, you just can't take that for granted. So understanding how your volunteer organization and its capacity with how it does impact your business is truly, truly a thing that you just can't let go of, and you really should be thinking about how do we further make the case in advance of difficult decisions needing to be made instead of after those decisions needed to be made.
Joshua, I'm going to kick it over to you.
I shared this adage with you all when we were doing our prep call, but I used to work with a guy who's still a dear friend, and he used to say revenue generating activities only. And we used to get a kick out of it in meetings. But he was really, really serious about that. And as you said, when you posed this question to us, why is this always the first thing to get cut when times get hard? It's because how people look at it and say, how is this generating revenue? How is this moving us forward, moving us along? And I think, when our backs are to a wall, that's what people think. Where can we cut? And unfortunately, if, to Stacy's point, if we can't see how this is benefiting us, it's very easy to just letting it go, even if as managers of volunteers or people who have managed volunteers, we know this has a lot of value for our organization. So it really is about getting in front of it, as Stacy said, and figuring out ways to quantify your work because that's what people understand. They understand dollars and cents.
So just to tag on to that. So when I had the conversation when I was laid off over a year ago, and I was like, Joshua, I just don't understand. Like, our organization gives almost like $1 million in-kind donations, and we do all of these things. And he was like, Nicole, I'm gonna tell you something. I'm telling you this as my friend. He was like, but the fact of the matter is, in-kind donations don't pay the bills. So that was a light bulb for me because I was so concerned about, like Stacy said, sharing the stories, sharing the in-kind donation. that I never shared the ROI and I never shared the fact of how many of our volunteers were actually donors who were also bringing in money, and it was never considered. And so what I got from that is it's not that our programs are important, and it's not even that it's being discounted, but if they have a line item and they're like, this program is bringing in this, and there's line items that are going down the list. And then it's like, this is bringing in this much, this program's bringing in this much, this program's bringing in this, and then the volunteer program, there's nothing there. It's not, sometimes I don't have time to be like, hey, director of volunteers, can you go back and get me those numbers? If they don't have it in that moment, they don't have time to go and ask you to consider to bring it in. So it leads me to my next question. How do volunteer managers get that information in front of our CEOs? Let's see, Anwar, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, and sometimes I'm not going to skirt the issue here because it doesn't always need to necessarily go to the CEO, right? Sometimes it needs to just go to your immediate director, or it needs to get to the CFO or whomever is making the decisions in those moments. That's going to be the critical step one. But two, it's really understanding what it is and what is it that you're trying to get accomplished. If you're, I love the example that you were talking about with the in-kind donations and understanding like what do we actually need to transform the business. If we're thinking about like, okay, it's $1 million in in-kind gifts, are these things that are used for a fundraising event? But if we're not having fundraising events, then those in-kind gifts are not, they're not helpful. Or we think about like during the pandemic where a lot of folks have like volunteer ushers in their venues. But if we're not having performances, then we don't need those volunteers and. So I think about from the beginning is really understanding what question are we trying to answer and what do those numbers look like. So if we're looking at pure volunteer like hours in terms of projects, right? Like if we're thinking of like Habitat for Humanity, we need 1,000 volunteers to build 50 homes, right? We understand the tangible benefits of doing that. We're not accomplishing our mission if we don't have those 1,000 people to build those homes. So in other cases, it is we need in-kind professional services. And sometimes those things are given through, it's not suggesting like your traditional volunteers in the same sense, but those things like we would actually spend money on. So really connecting the dots, figuring out what is it that we're trying to answer and saying, all right, I need to build out this case for support in advance, but also having that direct relationship again with the decision makers. So like I said, whether it's your manager, your director, your CFO, your CEO, your board chair, whomever it might be, like starting to build out that relationship up front, so that way you're not having to scramble like again on the back end. So I would say that would be my big piece of advice in terms of getting it in front of the right people.
I'll jump in
Okay, Joshua.
and add mostly because Sue here in the chat has said yes, too often the volunteer and donor staff and data don't talk. Sue is right. Um, this is an opportunity here where you can, we talk often about creating a culture of philanthropy in our organizations, but we should also be creating a culture of volunteerism. And one of the ways that you can do this is partnering with the departments who maybe your leadership sees as more valuable. So if I'm going and I'm talking to the director of development and I'm saying, I might know that my volunteers are helping to raise money. How can we marry what we're doing and what you're doing and get that into those materials? Because in development, we're always reporting on these things. How can we find some way to partner and figure out you're reporting on these donors, some of these donors are my volunteers. How can we share in that? How can we share in that reporting so that we can use it and you can use it as well?
I think what I would add to the discussion is just a few points that play off of what would have already been said, but we at our organization make sure that one of our top 5 strategic imperatives is to engage volunteers and have them engage in a manner where they're satisfied with the experience they have here. Because of that, volunteers are highly visible throughout the organization, even if it's not individuals that work with them day to day. So those goals also cascade down throughout all the different levels of the organization. So that's one thing I would also look outside of the things we're typically looking at in volunteer engagement, number of visits, number of this, number of hours. See if you can quantify some of the things that may speak to those difficult to reach individuals in your organization. So somehow are your volunteers contributing to increased referrals or increased ticket sales? How are they contributing as ambassadors in the community? So because of this volunteer pool, we were able to access and get connections that were key for our business development or community outreach team. Those are harder to measure, but again, those are going to speak to some of the different teams you work with that maybe you feel a little more siloed from. And I'm going to speak on silos. I think in volunteer engagement, the field, we tend to operate kind of as ourselves. We bring in the volunteers, we train the volunteers, we place the volunteers, we manage the volunteers, we thank the volunteers. But if you can think outside of doing it all yourself and somehow work to create an organizational culture where every department says, this is how I can use volunteer engagement or volunteer help to maybe make we call it here, let people working to the top of their skill set. Mm-hmm. So for us, if we have an RN who is spending 2 hours a week delivering some silly form to a patient because it never gets there, why can't we have a volunteer courier that impacts that? So we're really looking at how can we impact the organization as a whole's productivity and what they're doing just by the volunteer help. And some just quick examples. We have used licensed RNs to do clinical education so our nurses can be out in the field. So they're teaching things like Alzheimer's curriculum, helping with flu shots and different things, again, that would pull people from more important jobs, seeing our patients, and they're in doing those things. We've had volunteer pharmacists who help sit on meetings, and they'll sit there, and it saves our actual pharmacists from sitting through these honestly painful 3-hour meetings, but they have the same license and the same credentials. So we're letting them use their skills. And then if you're not using interns and you don't have good relationships with your colleges, you can also look at how can this impact our human resources department. And I will tell you, human resources and IT are friends that everyone wants to have in this world. But if you can get some people in who are looking at maybe this is what I want to do, and in exchange have them do some volunteer time, then also in return let them job shadow some individuals at your organization, you also might be able to have some really good employees who understand your mission later. So those are just a couple of little things that I think play off of what Joshua and Anwar had said already.
Thank you, Stacey. Those were really, really great. I'm going to take a quick second. Marianne, are there any questions in the Q&A section quite yet?
Not yet. Keeping an eye out.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so one of the challenges that I've heard in different rooms, which kind of led to my earlier question. I was like, how do you get this information in front of your CEO? And yes, Anwar, thank you for course correcting. I was like, hold on, let's go up through the channels, right? Like we don't want to like overstep and go around anybody. Where that came from is I have worked, and I know some of my fellow colleagues have worked for supervisors who either don't really see the value of volunteers. It was something that just got put under their, maybe like they were a program director, just like in general, they were a program director. And I was like, oh, we have this volunteer department. Oh, just put it under them. They really haven't had no experience with volunteers as far as they're concerned. Volunteers are a nuisance. And even when presenting information to the supervisor, it doesn't go any further. I have literally been in meetings where it was like an all staff meeting, and it was kind of like there was somebody would allude to something like, oh, we don't know that. And I'm looking at there and I'm like, that was in my last report to my supervisor. How did it not go up the chain? So if you have somebody who is not, thank goodness, according to the poll, we don't have anybody right now on this particular call, but it could be somebody who's watching the recording. If you don't have somebody who is a champion for you, how are you still able to get that value communicated when you don't have somebody that is championing it for you? Joshua, I'll come to you.
That's a tough question. I mean, I I think that we all have those challenges professionally where what we see as important to us isn't important to somebody else. I think this is an opportunity for persistence. You know, as I said, um, you know, people can't deny quantitative results and quantitative figures. And so if you are actively presenting those things, they really, really can't be denied. And so I think that's a place to start for sure. It isn't just about the adage, it isn't just about the story. You really have to put in front of people, of decision makers, let me say, things that they can't refuse, figures that they can't refuse. And that's a place to start. Bobby James in the chat has said having a champion is really, really important. Yeah, it is. It is. And sometimes it takes a bit of weaseling around your organization to figure out who that person is. And maybe they're not a member of staff, maybe they're a member of the board. And that's another avenue that you should be considering as well, because board members are just as important stakeholders sometimes as other members of staff.
And volunteers, board members are volunteers themselves. So they might have a
Yeah,
special ear to that.
They are.
They
Mhm.
might have a special ear to that.
yeah. Can I jump in just really quickly? Is really also what I would recommend here is to, if you have maybe there's an internal like company newsletter or something like that that people would be, and we tend to see this with bigger organizations where they're often looking for stories to tell about what's happening inside the internal, like just like internal communications. So maybe it might not be that one, the direct supervisor or the person that you report to, or that's, your CEO or whomever, but getting it into the hands of the people who do care is going to be important. Sometimes that means going left and right, but then also, maybe getting together with some of your peers and colleagues, put something in the Slack channel or the team channel about a good win that you had. The other thing that I would recommend here is also utilizing your own social media too, to talk about it. So put it on your LinkedIn, share it on your socials, because it's not only going to help you, one, to get it off of your chest, but also like to celebrate your own wins. Those things are going to those are going to matter. So tell people about what's going on, and I think it's gonna go a long way. And then wherever your career takes you from here, you're also keeping track of the things that you've done to help facilitate. So those are good things to put on your resume too. So that would be my recommendation.
Think they've made really good points. The other things I would just add to that is it depends who your supervisor is, but you can find people who are going to be your allies and champions, even if it's not your direct supervisor. And that's where relationship building does come in. We're really good in the volunteer field at building relationships with our volunteers, but sometimes we forget we've also got to build them with other colleagues who maybe are equals on the organizational chart and those up and down from where we sit on those charts too. And what I would recommend is the marketing team is always going to be a great group of individuals for you to relationship build. They're looking for positive stories about what you're doing with your organization. You have the stories. That is one thing we know about volunteer engagement. We have all of the stories that create all of the good feelings and the why behind our mission and the impact out in the community and the faces and the holding of hands, packing of food boxes. That's our wheelhouse. And we've got more than marketing could ever want. So really try to build there. And if you start getting more media attention because of what you're doing, other leadership are going to notice. They're on LinkedIn. They probably have some agreement where they're sharing posts from your organization. That'll get you noticed. Local articles. There's tons of awards you can apply for your volunteers with local chambers of commerces.
Mhm.
Go for those awards, and then eventually someone's going to win. You learn the nuances of writing nominations. Someone wins, your organization buys a table, and then your CEO is at a breakfast and they are hearing this wonderful volunteer and what they did. Again, that's not a 5-minute journey, but it's something to start working on. And then those internal relationships that you've built by maybe placing that fantastic volunteer in human resources so someone can go out and do recruiting events and doesn't have to sit behind a computer for 3 hours of their week. Those stories are going to start to make it up as well. You can implement maybe some surveying of director level colleagues. How can volunteer engagement serve you better? What are you missing out on? And that goes a long way too with your credibility. So those are just some, little nuggets that I'll add to what have already been said.
And I love all of those ideas. And I know, well, maybe not for everybody, but I know in the back of some people's minds are like, oh, that's so great, but I'm already tapped. How am I going to do all that? Find a volunteer to help you get it done. Like, I feel like often as volunteer managers, the first thing we do is when we hear something, like we feel like we have to be the ones to implement it. But take those ideas, recruit a volunteer, somebody who is um who is passionate about whatever said thing is, invite them into it and let them be able to help you do it. So don't get discouraged that it's like, oh yeah, all these great ideas, but how am I going to do it? Think of it as a way to expand your capacity to help get to those to help get those things accomplished. Um, forgive me if I'm saying your name wrong, but I think it's Takira or Takira. She had also mentioned that volunteer appreciation events and celebrations are a great way to get leadership involved. And that leads me right into one of the conversations that we had in getting prepared for this, why it's important and how you are getting leadership involved. Because Joshua, you brought up a really great point saying that often executive leadership, especially like CEOs or whatever, often the only time they hear about the volunteer program is that one rogue, upset volunteer who has gone off and they're like, I am writing a message to the CEO. And sometimes that is the CEO's only exposure to volunteers. So now they have an eminent negative taste in their mouth. So when it comes to, especially if that data is not there and it's time to have to cut things, all they know is like, the volunteer program is more than it's worth. So, um, uh, tagging on to what Takira said, how important is involving executive leadership, and what are other ways that you have seen it be done?
I love that question. It's true, a bad apple can really spoil it for the bunch. That adage really, really rings true. Um, I think Stacy made a great point, in we sometimes can lose sight of the fact that it is equally important to be developing the internal relationships as it is the external ones. And I want to piggyback off that as I answer this question. Getting to know your organization's chief of staff, the assistant of the executive, the person working in the executive leadership office, and sharing with them tidbits of information about what's going on, asking them to calendarize whatever you have going on with the volunteers. Maybe your leadership can show up at these things and see the work happening in real time. That is a perfect example. At the top of this, we spoke a lot about how can we get these things in front of leadership, bring them, find an opportunity for them to show up, or you create an opportunity where they can show up and they can see this work. And maybe that isn't an appreciation event, but maybe it's, leadership seeing the work of the volunteers in real time and seeing how it could be a cost-cutting measure, a time-cutting measure for other members of staff. Um, because that's undeniable, for somebody to see it firsthand. And so I think that, certainly requires, a bit of thinking outside of the box sometimes, or maybe thinking about, um, how will this illustrate the point that I'm trying to make? So maybe it isn't, the most random mundane task that your volunteers are doing. But if you have them sitting in a room, for example, and they're stuffing 5,000 envelopes to do a mailing, that is great for leadership to see, because somebody else from the development office or some other office isn't having to do that. And so they're seeing in real time what your volunteers are doing. And it's the perfect example.
I love
I
it.
think adding opportunities for them to engage with the volunteers who are highly engaged is important too. One of the things we implemented about 5 years ago is a special luncheon for volunteers hitting service milestones. So people with a 5 year anniversary, a 10 year anniversary, achieving 1,000 total hours with us, 2,000 hours. So these are individuals who either had significant time in terms of tenure or time in terms of hours invested in the organization. And for that, we made sure we had some C-suite level leadership because those are the individuals. And it was a smaller group than the big volunteer appreciation get together where you've got everyone there. And you know that rogue volunteer that we talked about is the one who's going to sit right next to your CEO for the whole thing. And you just sit there and sweat because you know it's going to take me a year to undo what's getting done in these 2 hours. We made sure that it's an audience when our C-suite is there that are going to feed them the feel goods and the this is how much I've given, and they're going to see the big highlights. So that's been a good success. And then we also invite them when we have parties. We have lots of social get-togethers, potlucks, and parties. We have our leadership serve the food. And that actually works well because a lot of times when we've invited leadership to things, they will say, well, I need to give me a job, give me something to do. If I'm going, I want to do something. And that works out incredible because we just park them somewhere and say, look, your job is to pour tea. Your job is to put ice in cups. Your job is to put this on the plate. And they're there, they're engaged, they feel purposeful, and they're getting to have conversation. So anything you can think of, to get them to where they feel like they have a purpose and they're not just wiping an hour off of their calendar and not really sure why they went, or to get them in the rooms with those individuals who are so involved. The other thing you can also try is your volunteers also want to know what's going on with your organization. They love volunteering for you. Something attracted them to the mission or purpose of the organization. So give them some information back. Do an annual town hall. Someone wrote about a brown bagging thing where the leadership was there. Do something where they get a kind of a state of the union. Here's how our organization's doing. This is where our opportunities are. And again, every so often we get someone who hears an opportunity and they say, I know that person that you need to know. So you just never, we think we know who our volunteers are, but we give them, even if you do an hour interview with them, there are still pieces of them that just don't come out in those questions you ask. And they could be a valuable key to something your organization really needs.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just a
So
really
go
quick
ahead.
thing to throw in there, because I'm on the receiving end of sometimes those grumpy letters and emails and things like that. Encourage your volunteers to also write good things too.
Mm.
Like if they have a really good experience, maybe, encourage them to send a letter, or just a quick note saying, what a great time they had, how much they appreciate, being able to be involved with the mission of the organization. And sometimes those things matter just as much too. I don't get nearly as many nice letters as I do angry letters, but when I do, like our volunteer, they have a quarterly board meeting, and I always show up to all of them just to give an update to what's happening with the organization, what's happening with our students and things like that. It helps that they also get checks too during that time. So it's a great time for me to show up. But then also I show up at their businesses too. Our two big ones, we have a consignment store and a book fair. And I help pack up books. I help, just go and buy books and things like that. So finding opportunities to connect with people in ways that is it's going to be a low lift for you, but also again to tell those positive stories. I think is something that sometimes we don't think about nearly as much.
And a beautiful residual result of that, I say like happy accident, because we've had opportunities in different organizations that I work with where we, like our CEO actually literally worked alongside volunteers and other things. It gets the volunteers also excited and they feel important. They're like, wow, it was enough that the CEO or the director of development or the VP of development was working alongside with me, which lets them know that the organization really does care about volunteers, which then filters and tracks all the way down. So what I love about everybody on this panel is you all are clearly fans of volunteers and understand the importance. The question that I have for you, number one, have you always been that way? And if not, at one point, did your mind change and be like, oh, I think there's more value to our volunteers than I thought? Joshua, I'm going to start with you.
Hmm. Now working in higher ed and coming from arts and culture, the way that we utilize volunteers is somewhat different. And the mandate on them is different than I've ever experienced. And no, not to jump too far ahead, but an anonymous attendee has said in the questions, I would like to know how I can get my coworkers to understand that our volunteers are not only here to do the things that no one else wants to do. And I see that here. Um, I think one of the things that higher education does really well is it has created roles, and I can't speak to every university, but the ones that I'm familiar with, it has created roles that are unique to the volunteers. So they aren't doing work that nobody wants to do. They're doing work that only they can do. And being here has shown me that shift. And should I ever find my way back in arts and culture, that is something that I think I would want to prioritize. How can we create opportunities for our volunteers that only they are qualified for? And is this an opportunity for us to illustrate to leadership that here's this thing that nobody else can do that only they can do, and here's why we really, really need them. And so, I would encourage people to figure that out, because I think it will charge the volunteers themselves in a way that they are feeling empowered, newly empowered, and they will feel that, and they will be able to feel what their value is to your organization.
Thank you. Stacy, I saw you come off of mute.
Yeah, I think I've always seen that volunteers were valuable. I started most of my career has been in volunteer engagement. However, I think the way I've thought about their value has changed. So initially it was, here are the things that we are currently allowing volunteers to do. And most of them were, like Joshua said, job descriptions that were different from staff. But I moved to thinking a little bit more, how can we utilize these individuals who we sometimes get these impressions of volunteers as retirees. We don't think about their professional background. We don't think about their skills. How can we look at these individuals and the backgrounds they've had and what they can do to truly enhance whatever our mission is? Whether that's we're understaffed in admin departments, we don't just need to have them putting papers in files. Why can't they use the computers and do data entry? Why can't we have people learning to go do presentations out in the community if they've got a background and we've got a vetting process? So I think I've started to view it less in terms of lots of people doing good things, more towards what I would call a human capital type of mindset, where there's actually a lot of benefit volunteers can have outside of putting them in the 4 or 5 boxes that our organizations tend to always put them in.
That's
Anwar,
great. I
thoughts?
mean, yeah, I don't know if I have much different to say. But I started actually as a volunteer in the box office. Well, no, actually, I started as a volunteer for the ballet first, and then got a job in the box office. So I think it's always been, this was like fresh out of college. So it's always been something that I believed in. But I think that when you look at it on different scales is, and what I love about what both Josh and Stacey were saying is that it's really human centered. We have to stop thinking about it in a way that I need a task to be done, and how do I increase my ability to, like, again, in nonprofit space, achieve the mission, right? We always have not enough resources to do the things that we need to do. And if there are people that are, ready to give their time, their talent, in many cases their treasure too, to be able to help an organization succeed, then it's like, how do we align that with making sure that it is a fulfilling experience for them? And that's what makes people stay around. When Stacey mentioned, like, talking about people achieving their milestones, And there are people that are still serving this organization because either their spouse loved it and or they really um, found a way to just be able to give back because what they can do is organize a bucket brigade. When we're doing a parks concert, it's like, we have a new person that's going to be over our consignment shop, and she had 23 years of retail experience working for Macy's. Like that's something that we wouldn't be able to, afford on our own to be able to bring someone in with that level of expertise. But she says, I have time. I can do this for you. And it's like, great. Like, didn't even know that that was going to be a thing. So understanding where your organizational needs are and trying to balance it out in a way that's going to allow people to feel fulfilled with what they're doing for and with your organization is the best way to go about it forward.
I love it. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes left, and there's 6 questions in the question and answer. So I want to at least address them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask them, and then I'm going to let each one of you take one. And if there's something that you feel passionate that you need to add in, then so be it. So let me see. The first question is from, I believe it's Hayat. How do you successfully fundraise or encourage development efforts for the operating costs of a volunteer engagement program in a way that highlights its essential support role without making it seem like resources are being taken away from direct program services? Stacy, you want to take that one?
Sure. We write lots of grants. There are grants out there that lend themselves to volunteer programs. Sometimes they're not directly labeled as volunteer program grants, but if you look for something that the founding or funding organization is looking for something that works with seniors and your organization works with seniors or works with first responders and you work with first responders, you can write grants for that. We do a lot of Amazon wish lists for the supplies and things we need for some of our projects and have great success going out to businesses and HOAs and different groups like that to support our wish list so we don't have to spend so much on supplies. Our volunteers will donate things. If, let's say, we have a veterans program and our goal is to have every veteran that we honor get a patriotic blanket when we go and honor them. When we put that out to the communities, they come back like tenfold. Like they want to help veterans and they didn't know we did that, and that's their connection with us. So I think you can do that. We are linked like this with our foundation. They are always looking for the things that make us different and the things that are going to make us attractive to people in the community. And a lot of those are the things that live in volunteer engagement. So it goes back to some relationship building, but grants, tons of grants out there. You just have to do the research and spend a good bit of time on Google because they are out there.
And I also like to tap in because again, I know people are like, but I don't have time. If you are by like a university or like a college, often if they have like a nonprofit management class, they tend to have like a grant writing class and they like to connect those people with nonprofit organizations in the community to help with those types of things. So I just want to give that as a capacity arm to work together because they're always wanting to help the local charities. Okay, so I'm going to Kyrie. Let me see. Actually, yes. Okay. Hello. I would love to hear any suggestions for helping to encourage leadership to embrace the growth of a volunteer management team. Our organization has grown across the board, including volunteers, which went from 230 to nearly 350. But our team has decreased by a person, and yet there's not a sense of urgency to grow the team to be able to effectively manage the increase. Any suggestions? Anwar, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I would. I don't have a silver bullet or a magic bullet to say because resources are always going to be a challenge, and sometimes we don't have the financial resources to bring on more people. But I think that if I were this volunteer manager, I would think about going from 250 to 350 is great. Um, but are we growing the numbers responsibly? So understanding like what do we actually need here and how do we think about like utilization of those volunteers? Sometimes having 100 more might mean you're able to reach a lot more people and that's really wonderful. but what kind of infrastructure could you build into maybe there are natural born leaders within that volunteer group. So do you build out some kind of like, a team captain or, some kind of like volunteer lead, somebody that has great organizational skills. Because sometimes there are people within that group to really think about, I'm great at organizing people. I might not be able to lift the 50 pounds. I might not be able to, do the 5K. But what I can do is go out and say, all right, I need this person to do this job, this job, this job, and this job. So understanding how do you utilize the resources that you do have in a way that can be much more effective. If there aren't more financial resources, just increase your paid staff to be able to do so.
Thank you. Great answer. Joshua, I'm coming to you. This is from Allie. If I'm sitting in front of executive director or board trying to talk to them about the importance of volunteers, what kinds of things should be included?
Well, first of all, you should remind the members of your board that they themselves are volunteers. Don't let them forget that. I think that it's very easy for board members to think that because they might be writing a check and because they sit in a board meeting once a quarter or a few times a year, or maybe a committee meeting once a month, that they aren't volunteers. They're still volunteers, just with a bit more glory. Remind them of that. Let them know that and let them know that um, that that volunteerism is a spectrum. They are on the far end of the spectrum, but we have people everywhere in between. And so talk to them about the value that being a volunteer adds and make them think critically about their own experience as a volunteer for your organization and what that's like for them. You could even emphasize that maybe uh, this is creating a pipeline of something. So maybe a pipeline of new donors, a pipeline of more volunteers, a pipeline of new board members. So you can do sort of maybe you can call it like future planning, looking forward into the future and saying, we're trying to create a pipeline here because you will not be here forever or I will not be here forever. How do we create a pipeline of people who can do this work, who are interested in this work, who understand our organization, a succession plan of sorts, as Uzma said here in the chat.
And to tag on to that, Marianne, if you can drop in the chat. It's funny that you should ask that, Allie, because literally the hybrid conference theme this year is called Show Them the Money. And it's not so much like, the value of a volunteer is all that matters and money is the only thing that matters. But it's talking to them and like, these are specific data points that if you want to get their attention, these are those things. That's literally what the entire conference is about coming up. So I think Marianne dropped the link in the chat. Look into going to that conference for that exact reason. Okay, so we do have one more question, but before we get to it, just in case we run out of time, I want to make sure that because from the conversation that we all had prior, in preparing for this, there's a couple of things that you all wanted to make sure that we leave the meeting with. And one of them was understanding that we're all on a team working together. Your executive director or your executive leadership isn't necessarily just like pointing you out as the person to say, oh my gosh, it's the volunteers, we're trying to get rid of them. It is, we are all working together and we have to help each other get what each other needs so that the organization as a whole can move forward. So if an executive director is in a position where they have to make a split-second decision and they don't have your information, it's not personal. It's how do we make sure that they have what they need? So now we make it a little bit more difficult to have to get rid of us, right? Let's make it a challenge. Then maybe not. Look at everything that they're bringing in. But if the information is never there, we don't have a chance. We just, when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, we have to pay the electric bill. That's just what it is. What I got out of this was stories can only go so far. It's the data is what ultimately matters. Depending on who you are talking to in the room that you're in, like for marketing, like the stories are great. And even when we're sharing with our executive leadership, the stories are great. But at the end of the day, do the stories, are they accompanied with information to help them make data driven decisions. Because as I have elevated in my profession, and as these two gentlemen can say, and I know Stacy, especially coming from a background where you started out as a volunteer coordinator and you've moved your way up, the conversations are become different. It becomes definitely strategic and numbers based as much as volunteer engagement. We're like, but it's not all about the numbers. Depending on who and what you're talking about, it can literally only be about the numbers. That the thing is, we have the numbers. We just have to get it. And I see it more like as translation, right? This, like the story is there, but how does that translate into the data? Because typically the data is there to support that story, because the story wouldn't have happened if the data didn't happen. But we can't always speak Spanish to somebody who's only English speaking. How do we translate so that they understand what we're talking about, which is what the hybrid conference is about. And then to point to what Joshua said, that everything has to be showing that it's adding great value to the organization. So again, not only just in the stories, but what is the data behind it? And then, Anwar, one of the things that you mentioned was especially any type of data that shows year-over-year growth, and attached to what you had said, are we not only just growing, but are we growing responsibly? I think that's probably one of the things that I'm going to take from this. It's not just about the growth, because it's true, we can grow and grow and grow, but if we don't have infrastructure to support it, are we growing responsibly? Because that could actually because irresponsible growth can actually harm us more than it can help us. I'm taking away that nugget. Okay, so Cheryl has a question. We have 4 minutes left. How best to handle when it's time for a volunteer to phase out of service. Or I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh. Or work with them before burnout happens. The reason why I chuckled is because we literally just had an Alive Academy that literally talks about best buys, and it's how to say goodbye to volunteers. So that's a whole nother conversation, but I will let them answer. Who wants to go? How to best handle it when it's time for a volunteer to phase out of service or work with them before burnout happens.
So I think what I would say is have policies on it and have procedures so you don't have to figure that out when it comes up. We purposefully have requirements for the amount of time in certain roles that people have to give a year. That gives us that leverage at the end of the year if someone's been MIA, except for attending some luncheons and the fun stuff. And we can see that in our data. We know that it's probably time to give them a call, and it's not a mean call. It's it looks like life has been busy, happens to all of us. We're going to not bother you for a while. Please feel free to call us back anytime when things calm down. It's not you, it's me type of discussion. But if you have policies and procedures, we have everyone sign a code of ethics when they come on board saying that they understand. These are basic performance things that not only volunteers, but all of our employees are held to. We have that if they're not aligning with our mission, or they're, again, starting to just not be a good fit, we've got that. Have forms, document conversations. It's really the same as leading employees in that way. It's harder because they're not getting a paycheck, but you have to do that for your organization's liability and for the credibility of your program. And so that rogue volunteer doesn't end up sitting next to your CEO at the luncheon for 2 hours.
And
I agree.
Go ahead.
I love what Stacy said. I think one of the things we touched on in our pre-call here is volunteer work deserves to have the same level of governance as all of the other work in your organization. So to Stacy's point, you should definitely have some processes and procedures in place. And one of the best ways that you can do this is with term limits, or limits to how long somebody can be a volunteer. Because if you have someone who they aren't doing a great job, as we've been saying, the person who you don't want to have sitting next to your CEO, if they're on a 1-year term as a volunteer, you don't have that much longer with them. You know that their service will be ending. And what this also does, by having these terms, whatever you decide them to be, what a lovely opportunity to go to a volunteer and say, hey, you've done a really great job. We'd love to ask you back. Thank you for all that you've done. What a great surprise and delight that can be. A really, really wonderful opportunity to recognize somebody from their work. That could come from your boss, if you have it, if you're not the leader of your volunteer efforts. That can come as a letter from the CEO. Going back to our earlier points of creating a culture of volunteerism, now you have more people having a stake in this work and how it's being moved along in the organization.
I mean, that's beautiful. That's like the perfect way to wrap this up. Joshua, Stacy, Anwar, we are on the dot. Thank you all so much. I could encourage each and every one of you. Marianne will drop each one of their LinkedIn is we'll drop it in the chat. We will go through and look, and I'll try to find because I know a lot of people drop some really great resources. And we will send it out. If you registered for this, we'll send out a link to this to watch this as well as those resources. But connect with them. They are here. This is, I think, the biggest bridge that we as volunteer engagement professionals for us in order to elevate our profession, we have to learn how to speak outside of our bubble, so to speak. Because I'm telling you, Joshua popped it, man. He popped that bubble. So I was just like, I didn't, and I think is I didn't even realize I was living in that bubble until he brought it to my attention. And so I want us all to be able to think outside of the box and think about what that looks cross-departmentally. Thank you all so, so much, Joshua, Anwar, Stacey. We truly appreciate having you here for this panel. Thank you for everybody who joined us, and we hope to see you on the next one when that happens. This was so great. We're going to have to do it again. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you. Bye-bye. Let me see.